I'm Dr. Blackwell. I teach in the theology department. I help direct our seminary, which is just a theological graduate school. Been here at HBU about 9 years. Teach New Testament and church history, systematics. I've been told I'm the best Christian ethics professor that HBU has on campus. I'm also the only Christian ethics professor on campus. So, what else? That's the only undergrad class I'm teaching this semester. But so I roam around doing things like that. So it's a pleasure to be with you and to talk about the Bible. Besides doing biblical studies and stuff, for those of you that my first degree as an undergrad was in accounting, and so for 7 years I worked as an actuarial consultant, which just means that actuaries are math majors that work on probabilities, like when are you going to get sick, when are you going to die, all that kind of stuff, so they can tell you when the probability of all that kind of stuff is going to happen. So I have wider expertise other than just the Bible, which is why I ended up teaching ethics, right? Because it's a more integrative aspect. But to do ethics well, to do theology well, is to read the Bible well. And so the Goheen and Bartholomew book is one that's trying to pull together, right, the drama of Scripture to put it into a wider narrative arc so that you see the inner coherence of the Bible. So before we start talking about that, I want to give you and your immediate neighbors a quick kind of icebreaker question. And it's this: I want you to list all kind of the stereotypical things that you would say about Jesus, like what characteristics you would say about Jesus in one column, and then in a second column, what are the stereotypical kind of characterizations people would have about the God of the Bible? Right? So just have two columns, maybe compare, contrast as well. But what are some of the adjectives, characteristics that you would have put in a column about Jesus, and then a column about the God of the Bible? So you do this in pairs, right? You don't have to just do it by yourself, right? It's a conversation starter here. What are some of those characteristics? I also printed out copies of the handout for the chart. If you don't have one, then you can take one. Oh, excuse me. Sorry.
This is one of those paintings that prove whether or not you're like a dirty guy. Okay. You are just too
Okay, so let me come back and ask or present, right? So we've got Jesus, God of the Bible. There's two basic approaches to the way that you see how the Bible works, right? And so one is like this, where you have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so when Jesus shows up, the Old Testament is coming to an end and things are radically new here. The other approach is more like this, to where Jesus is seen as the climax of a story that has already been going on, right? So let me ask you this. When we come to like this question of Jesus and the God of the Bible, what version do most people, and by most people, your stereotypical list of those two, what version of the narrative of the Bible is undergirding kind of the way that we think about that? Yeah, so chat with your neighbor about that. What's behind that? Like, why do we see, if they are different, if it is the top version, why is that? And what's behind, what would it look like then for this to be the case? So again, think through that with one another.
Right? Like the beginning, like when you're like preschool, right? You're building your so the thing you need to do is like trying to do like separate. We did this like sixth grade from birth. You know? Come out of the womb, somebody have a textbook that says New Testament, Old Testament. Yes. Yeah. You know?
Okay, so what is it about our columns that make this top one the more kind of stereotypical view that people have?
There's more of a division between the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, so division there. What about, yeah?
I think there's this ridiculous idea that somehow as man advances, we're growing increasingly civilized, and so you can look on the past as primitive and savage, and then all that turns around and God's all nice and friendly now in the New Testament.
Okay, so there, definitely as a reading strategy that does get imposed back on the Bible, right? Yeah.
How we're taught to memorize the books of the Bible.
Okay, tell me.
Because like in like Bible drill or whatever, you're like, oh, well these are this one, and then this is this one. Keep this one separate, and keep this one section. There's a category for Old Testament. There's a category for New Testament.
Okay, yep. So there's definitely some kind of, I mean, we do call it the Old and New Testament, right? In that sense, in that sense, our basic categories do help reinforce that. What other thoughts? So let's turn it around. What would these look like if we were telling the story this way? If this was the way that we conceived that the Bible worked? What would we have to be different about our columns? Somebody else that hadn't. Okay.
More or less. You can't have a radically different Jesus and God if you're seeing Jesus as the climax of the Bible and everything that God has been doing.
Yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be the same, right? There's some progression, but it would be in continuity for sure, right? Yeah? Like, what kinds of things then should we see in continuity?
You know the song He Is?
Okay, yeah, so,
Jeffrey, like
yeah.
how Jesus is in every single one of the books of the Bible.
Okay, so there is this question, and so this is one of the big questions about hermeneutics, right? Hermeneutics has historically been something that Christians and particularly biblical scholars cared about. How do you interpret text? Where does meaning reside? And so now hermeneutics is the postmodern question. How does any text convey meaning? But in that sense, one of the biblical questions of hermeneutics, of interpretation, how much of echoes, like so when we see, let me take an example. There's a story in the Old Testament in Genesis about a man that is sold into slavery by his brothers, and so in effect, but then through his suffering, they come to redemption and restoration, right? That's the story of Joseph. And so there's echoes of the Joseph narrative in Jesus' story. To what extent not do we see forward-looking those echoes in Jesus' story, but actually go back and take Jesus' story to interpret Joseph's narrative. Because the writer of the Joseph narrative didn't have any clue who Jesus was, right? So to what extent can we go backwards with that? And so the He Is song there is to that question is like, where do we see Jesus in the Old Testament? Is it just where you see mention of Davidic Messiah, or are there other places that we might see continuity, backwards continuity, not just forwards? What else would have to be different about our columns here than the stereotypical way that we'd approach that?
Would you even accept the framing of it as we have two columns here, the Jesus attributes and the God attributes? That seems to inherently buy into a mistaken...
It depends. Yeah, so is Jesus only God? Like if Jesus was only seen as divine, but of course in Christian theology, Christ is both divine and human, right? So that everything is not going to be simply the same in that sense. There's two approaches basically to biblical studies, very technical approaches that I like to call lumpers and splitters, right? And so in the Enlightenment and modernism, you had a definite move towards splitting text. And so they weren't the ones to invent this idea of the Old Testament versus the New Testament, but one of the things that does happen even more and more is you divide up the text according to which historical author is writing what, and therefore don't try to mix them together. What's the time span of text that we were talking about, just even the Old Testament? So taking Genesis out of the equation, where we have recorded historical data, right, what kind of time span are we talking about here?
Jericho around 1500 BC?
Yeah, so say 1500, give or take, 14, 8, whatever, to what's the end? Somebody on this side of the room. What's the end of the Old Testament dating? 400 BC or so? Well, no, if we're talking about the Old Testament, right, we're going to get to the Restoration, Chronicles, right, Ezra, Nehemiah, they come back, reestablish the temple. We're talking about 400 or so. So we're talking about 1,000-year time frame for the Bible, for the Old Testament, at least as far as recorded history goes. What kind of literature are you talking about in English literature that's 1,000 years old? Yeah, early medieval, high medieval, right? You're talking about 1000 AD, right? We're not talking much about English literature at all. You have some, but mostly it's in Latin, right? You don't have the rise of English literature until after that. But so when we're talking about the Hebrew Bible then, when you're looking at this, at the Bible, and of course the New Testament as well extends it another 500 years, are we expecting it to be a whole lot the same, or should we expect it to be a whole lot different? Is literature very different now versus 1,000 years ago? So when we come, and the deception of reading a text that is all bound together and all in one language and all written at an 8th grade reading level, it deceives us at times that the Bible is much more homogeneous than we expect it to be. Now that doesn't mean that it's contradictory, but we should expect that there's diversity in the text. However that diversity plays out, that there's a lot of diversity in the text. 1,000 years of diversity in the Old Testament, right? And so that there's going to be different ways of approaching, different cultural expectations, different cultural values. And so the way that you approach God is going to be growing, morphing. And so in the Enlightenment, one of the big focuses that came out of modern biblical studies is to attend to the very different voices throughout Scripture. In fact, you attended very much to the human author. What happened in that setting? And so that's the splitting, right? Because you're looking at, well, if something's written in Genesis and Exodus, then it's going to be very different than something that's going to happen in Chronicles or Malachi, right at the very end of this narrative. And so you're going to expect historically different settings, different values, even different approaches to theology and God, right? Once different things arise. The other emphasis or mode of approaching the text is that of the lumpers, right? People that put it all together into one story and want to see a consistent, coherent thread around that. Now, theologically, one of the main reasons the church has done that is because rather than the human author as the basis of the text, is that it would be one divine author that overarches the whole story, the whole narrative. And so in that sense, if you're engaging the same God, right? And so Christians, as we're reading the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament, Christians still consider themselves monotheists. So that means there's one God who brings coherence to the whole story. And so there are aspects of the text, right, that lead us in both directions. And it's the same dilemma that we have with Jesus. Is Jesus just God? According to Christian theology, no, he's not just God. He's both 100% human, and so the issues that we expect for humanity, we should see at play in Jesus, but he's also 100% divine, right, as according to theology, historical theology, and orthodox theology. And so in that sense, when we come to Scripture, the same tensions reside there as well. These are human texts. They're human words, right? They attend to human standards of grammar and syntax, style, poetry, right? But there's also, we affirm, at least here at HBU, right? These are the words of God as well. And so that tension between the two, between the diversity of the witness of Scripture, is bound up with a tension with its unity as we engage the God of Scripture. And so that sets us up here as far as where the tensions we're going to face. Now, one of the things, since the basic presumption is this one here, right? The lecture I'm about to give you over the next couple of weeks is going to be down here, right? Because your natural presumption is to see the diversity in the text, or at least some basic diversity, even if you've not engaged it much before. And so we are at times likely going to miss the unity of the text. And that's definitely what Bartholomew and Goheen are doing as well. They're trying to say, when they call it, like, how do you read a book, right? Always look at the title of the book first, the drama of Scripture. They see a progression of a single narrative, right, that is undergirding these things. Now, of course, like any good plot and any good book, right, the narrative twists and turns and it progresses and you have more people that join into it, but it's a united narrative. And so in that sense that it coheres in ways that, that we're talking about here. All right, so one of the main ways then that we're going to jump into this is via the Old Testament covenants. But before we get there, I want to come and start with Revelation. So in your Bibles, right, the last Revelation ends with chapter 22. So this is the penultimate chapter of the Bible. And you have this vision where John the Elder sees heaven coming down to earth, that there's a new heavens and a new earth. And death is no more. God resolves the problem of pain and mourning. And it's a great vision there. In fact, if we go to this next chapter, though, chapter 22, this is the last chapter of the Bible, what themes do we see echoed in this ending bit? If we're going to think of the narrative arc of the Bible, from Eden all the way over there to Genesis 1 and 2, to over here to Revelation 22. So what themes, so somebody that's not said anything yet, what themes or echoes do we see in this text to other parts of the Bible?
The fruit
Okay, so we have fruit here. So there's fruit throughout the Bible at different times, right? Okay, the river. So where do we see rivers? Okay, so there's different rivers in the Bible as well, right? So okay, Eden, right? So Eden, if you remember, there are 4 rivers that come out from Eden there, so there's a sense there. In fact, Eden, right? So think just visually here, we get to the very end of the Bible, and it says, what is it going to look like when things are the way God wants them to be? It's going to look exactly like, or very similar to the way the story started out in the beginning. Right? People living on earth, where plants and animals are there. You have life, abundant life. And of course, now you probably won't be familiar with this, but Eden theology, right, has a temple kind of metaphors. And so when we come to other aspects of the story, we'll see how this plays out. But so the text itself is already giving you what version of reading the text. Old starts with radically new or continuity. Right? So this text at least, right? Revelation, so again, it's a voice of that. But the text itself is leading us to see it in continuity. And so that's what I hope to do today and then next week as well, is to point out those aspects of the text that point to its interest in showing their continuity between the old and the new there. All right, one of the things that's fundamental about all this is that Christianity is ultimately a rescue religion. Right? You have other religions that are not so much about rescue. So like Buddhism is not so much a rescue religion in the sense where you have to have an intervention to find a resolution of the problem. Now there is a problem, right? Suffering and that it derives from desire, but it's not like you're rescued from that. You resolve into what you were headed to in the end anyway. And I would say that the whole story of the Bible is ultimately about this rescue, right? Creation, fall, where the problem is introduced, and then you have the resolution of the problem. And so as we look through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, as fundamental for Christian theology, is that you have this development of covenants that explain or play out what does that rescue look like from the problem of evil. Right, so this is basic, yeah, in that sense. So I'm not, hopefully, not telling you anything too unique there. One important aspect that you should know here: when we say covenant or testament, the word testament is the Latin word for covenant. So when we say the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're actually saying the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And so this language comes from the New Testament itself, right? In the words of institution, that Jesus says this is the blood of the new covenant, as when he's taking the Lord's Supper with his people. Paul also uses this language as well. But even the whole idea of the new covenant or the New Testament actually comes from the Hebrew Bible itself. In fact, it was very popular at the time that Christianity arose for lots of Jews. So we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts, Jewish texts that are not Christian texts, but Jewish texts around the time of the first century that are talking about a new covenant, right? They're looking for this renewal. And so Christians were just a version of what they thought this new covenant was going to look like. And so you can go look and see in various places where covenant plays out. So again, we're going to talk about different types of covenant. So this is where we're getting to the chart, right, that I handed out to you. Now hopefully you've read some of these texts. We're going to work through the key lens, a key text for each one of these passages that we're going to do. And so we'll should get through Moses today, and then we'll do the rest, Davidic, the New Covenant, and the New Testament next week. One of the things that's fundamental to our approach here is getting the sense that these three aspects here, what I call the what. So what does it look like for the individual in the text to relate to God? So that's more the individual. The who, right, the community. How do humans relate to one another in the text? And the where, right? So we might say the look up, the look around, and look down, right? Very complex reading strategy. Right, these are basic ideas. But so just hopefully, but let me give you a picture that maybe helps you conceive of how these relate to one another. As we go throughout the Bible, all three of these are engaging one another. So you've got God, so this is the three, what is it? What do you call a pyramid that has three sides on the bottom? I mean, it's a triangular prism, right? Anyhow, for those of y'all that trying to wonder, it says God at the top, and then you've got the individual, the community, and the land as the 3 points on the base of that pyramid. And so theology, we're talking about theology here. How does God relate to the story of the Bible? Well, we're going to see throughout that God is constantly engaging all three of these aspects, right? And so no one of the aspects, right, individual, community, and land or place, right, these are the three aspects of this triangle at the base here. And so we're going to see that they are always engaged and connected to one another. What's our impulse when we read the text? What are we going to be drawn to most naturally? The individual, the community, or the land? Yeah, right? So this is part of just the march through Western history has been a shift from communal perceptions of identity to more of an individualist conceptions of identity. So as readers of the text, of course, the individual is there, right? It's fundamental. And particularly Christianity as a conversionist religion is always in some way going to prize the individual because you don't generally convert as a whole group. Oftentimes, and it's a singular conversions, right? Baptisms we don't baptize whole families at once. We baptize individuals, even if they're part of a family that converts together. And so, of course, that's not the individual. Sometimes we can overreact and reject the individual aspect. But as readers today, as good postmodern readers, we need to come back and remember that the community and the land is here. And this plays out. I'll put a side note to, hopefully I'll remember to mention this later, but I was reading Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail yesterday. And he's it's very interesting to see how he brings these three things together as his exposition of Christian theology. That you can't talk about a person and things going wrong without all of these playing together. And so, right, this is a whole different issue, but there are different theological traditions as a whole that will prize one or over the other. And so politically, just as an interesting kind of question here, the Christian right tends to give value to individual responsibility. And so if there's something that's wrong, then we need to change individual people, whereas the Christian left will tend to focus on the community. So if there's something wrong in society, what do you need to change? Well, it's the communal structures, right, that need to change, and that would free up people to do things well. And of course, the Bible transcends that and says yes to both, right? There are individuals that are responsible, but also communal issues here as well. And so in that sense, depending on where your political persuasion is, that will also drive the way that you read text as well. And so that's important. Okay, so we're going to jump in here. We're going to start with creation. Now, some of these texts are going to be, what I have up here is illustrative of the wider context. So it may not all three of these questions be answered within this singular text, right? So you're going to have the whole chapter or two in relation to this in mind as well. So read this. And so as we're doing this, right, I want you to attend to what the text itself is saying. So what are the key terms and phrases that the text itself is emphasizing related to the three columns that we have there? Right? So why don't you read through this and then chat with your neighbor about what are the key terms or phrases you see that might describe, again, how does the individual relate to God, the look up, and then how do humans relate to one another in this narrative, the look around, and then what kind of place are they at? What's their relationship to the physical world? Right? So where does this text fit within that taxonomy? So read that and chat with your neighbor about it.
You have all the big badges over there.
I have all. Okay, so let's think through this. So let's start with the where. This is the easiest bit. What do we see land or place in this text? Earth.
Okay, so they're earth, right? And so, of course, what's the wider context of this passage in Genesis 1? Yeah, the Garden of Eden, right? So that's the place. Like there's a garden, but they have a certain role or engagement with this place. What are some of the kind of things that they're doing to engage this place? Okay, so dominion is a key term here, right? Again, so you've got engagement with the animals, right? But particularly, right, they're going to rule over it, right? Subdue it. There's this perception. It's not clear exactly how the author here is conceiving this, but it seems like you have the earth, and then the garden is somewhere in between it, or in it, right? The garden. And in the garden, there's order. But the rest of the world appears to be chaotic, right? And so their task is to take that order and subdue or bring order to the chaos that's there. Yeah?
So we ascribe chaos to the rest of the world because the injunction is subdue it.
Yeah, so you wouldn't need to subdue if it's already just running according to God's plan as it is. Now, it doesn't mean that chaos is evil per se. You see water in these texts. The Jews, by and large, were not seafaring people. And so anytime you see water in the Bible, it's usually a symbol of chaos in some ways. And so like when Jonah is fleeing out to Nineveh, right? He goes off to the ocean, you have this whole thing, and it's like that's where chaos exists.
But one of the main things about creation narrative is like there's a lot of water involved there. And so that this area, when the water is there, it's a lot of chaos until God comes and brings order to that. Now again, that's a kind of broader, right? We're taking it a step further, but it seems pretty clear based on the way the text goes. And of course, there's a lot of ancient creation narratives that people compare these texts to. So like not the Enuma Elish. What is that it? I get the one about the flood narrative there. But chaos is inherent to most of the ancient creation narratives because the gods are fighting with one another, right? And then they create the world out of the blood of the gods and all this kind of stuff. Now this is much more tame, right? It's not like an evil chaos of battle and war. God is taking unformed things and making something better out of it. And so there is a distinct kind of rejection of some of these ancient cosmogonies that when this text is being written, that it's offering a competing narrative there. All right, so that's the land, right? So let's take it to the who, the community here. What are some of the communal texts? So somewhere back here in the back then, where do we see human community here? Okay, be fruitful and multiply. What does that mean? Sex. Right? There's a presumption, but what is that? What's the kind of term that's going to, like, what's the view or perception of what humanity looks like in this picture? Yeah, it's a family. It's a large family, right? It's growing, right? And it's important there, working together. What particular aspects of the family do we see at play here? Yeah, male and female, right? So they are working together. In fact, both together created in the image of God, right? And so that plays out. All right, so then what's the vertical aspect, like the individual? What's the kind of, and particularly how is God relating to them? What language do we see here? Maybe somebody up here in the front. What language do we see as God is relating to, or them in relation to God? Any key terms we see? Yeah, so image of God, humanity, right, exists. Any other terms? How does God feel about these people? Yeah, he blesses them, right? Means his intention is for their flourishing. Anyhow, so all good things here, right? Again, I think probably the only thing that we would add here is the fullness of life. Part of this is reading this in light of the earlier bits. What does Eve mean? Anybody had Hebrew in here? Life, yeah. What is Eve's name in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint? Zoe, right? Because Eve, she's the mother of life, right? So in that sense that there's a fullness of life here that is God's intention for people, that they're working together, and all those things. But one of the terms, right, this doesn't show up in the text, but shalom. When one of these aspects, the individual, the community, and the land, when one of these aspects works right, they all work right together. You get that? And that's what shalom, peace. Integration may be a good word for that. They're integrated. All right, so moving forward. If you want the easy, right, single term. Good stuff there. Okay. All right, so we're moving on to chapter 3 then, so to the fall, right? So there's a promise not to eat of the fruit. They eat of the fruit, and then this is the consequences of that. So again, read this text and then chat with your neighbors. I noticed that a couple of you were reticent to discuss with your neighbor, so I'm going to encourage you to open your mouth this time. It's much more enjoyable, these things, if you're not listening to me talk the whole time, right? So
chat about something. I would prefer you chat about the text at hand, but at least participate in the community that God has set you in, right?
Let's work on some shalom.
Okay, yes. All right, so read this text and think in these three categories. Okay, so let's work through this again. All right, so let's take a step back. So this isn't going to be mentioned here so much, but where do we see the land at play here? What happens to them?
They're kicked out of the garden.
Yeah, they're kicked out, right? So that's not a good thing. Now they still have a place to go to, right? But it's not the best place. So that is important to capture some of that. Anything else about the land here that's important? Okay, so it's cursed. What is that? How does that relate to? What's in distinction of what we saw in chapter 1 and 2? Somebody? Yeah?
It's difficult to farm or to cultivate. It'll take hard work to be able to gain anything from the ground.
Okay. Did you have anything else there? Or, yeah.
I was just going to say it will produce thorns and thistles, so like Tate said, it'll be hard to farm.
Yeah, so again, it's not like they have no place, no land to subdue, but it's going to be harder, right? So that's important. So the whole idea here is the furthest extent of the problem is not experienced. There's a anyhow, we'll come back to and we'll see other examples of this. Okay, what about community? Somebody on the third row. The third row has been fairly silent here. Where do we see community at play in this text?
It's actually a loss of community because instead of equals now, the woman is ruled over by the man.
Yeah, so there is a question, right? Was there hierarchy in chapter 1 or not in 2? But clearly it's not exactly clear what it means that her desire will be for her husband, but definitely a part of what we would call the fall here is that he's going to rule over her. So it's not working the way it should have worked, right? That the community maybe not lost altogether, right? But it's not working the way we would hope. What's something else? So third row here. What's something else that's not working well about community? Yeah. So again, they're still having children, but not doing it as easily as God intended, right? So again, the furthest extent of what sin could have brought does not happen.
So when we come to the individual then and relationship with God, so we're moving down the line here, so we'll keep with the third row. What happens here? What breaks down between the individual and God? What kind of language would we use to describe this?
I don't think we'd be in his likeness anymore, or certainly less. We're created in his likeness, but now we've committed the sin.
Yeah, so this is a really hard, and you'll see throughout church history of interpretation, so not just Christians, but also Jews and others that are reading this text, is where does the image reside? Is it totally gone? Is it a scarred image now? A blurred image? Sometimes you'll see things like that. You said something about blessing. What would be the antonym to blessing? Cursing, right? Now again, we don't see cursing directly of the humans here, but when we read the wider context, we're going to see that their experience is cursed, even if they themselves are not directly here in the text. What's the other key? So we had the fullness of life before. What would be the antonym of life? Is death. In fact, this is the center of the story, right? That if you eat of the fruit, then you're going to die, right? And so there's a big question, did God lie? And I would go back to what we saw with the land and with community. The fullness of the extent of the effects of sin could have been much worse than they actually were, right? They do ultimately die, but it's a partial death, right, that then plays out and brings mortality that ultimately leads to death, but not at that second that they ate. And so in that sense, there's a tension there. One of the interesting things here, Ash Wednesday, what does anybody know what the priest or minister says to you as they put the...
Dust thou shalt return.
Yeah, dust, and it comes from this text. And so when it says that you're going to return to dust, what is human identity ultimately then framed in terms of? Yeah, the ground, right? Identity here, there's this connection here actually between these two things. In fact, what is the nature of sin in this text?
Taking the fruit of the ground.
Yeah, I mean, right? So sin fundamentally is abusing the land, the ground, the place that God had told them to subdue, and it's being subdued or ordered by them. Or so instead of their task to bring order to chaos, what does the narrative say here? They've actually let chaos come and disturb the order. And so they reverse the actual purpose and flow and expectation of the text there. Whoop. So instead of shalom, all of these things working together, we have the anti-shalom, right? The disharmony. Instead of integration, we have disintegration. Everything is coming, and that's basically what death is. Corruption in the Bible is things that are supposed to be working together start to come apart at the seams. So that happens in their physical bodies, that happens mentally, it happens in their relationship, it happens, they're separated from the land, right? Everything gets ripped apart. Yeah.
Do you think there's supposed to be a literary connection between the Adam specifically being created out of the dust of the ground and now the dust of the earth is cursed?
Yeah, man, I think that, so part of this, so it's very hard for us to conceive of this because, again, we tend to think of individuals as disconnected from both of these, right? Individuals as isolated from the community. The community is only built up of individuals who happen to work together or covenant together. That community is not essential to the human identity in that sense. And the same way that we consider the land, so this is always this question of the dualism between the physical and spiritual. There are a couple of movies, actually they're just one movie, but they have two different
well, I don't know. Avatar was made by Disney, wasn't it? Yeah. Disney made the exact same movie, but in a cartoon form called Pocahontas, right? The foreign person goes to another land, and then the guy hooks up with the local girl, right? Then he helps them fight against. I'm sorry, I'm just blowing your mind here, but what's fundamental? What's the idea that undergirds like both of those texts or the movies? Yeah, everything is in harmony, right? In fact, there's like some kind of what we would call a pantheistic impulse to this, that your identity, there's some life force that connects all these things. And I don't think the text here is pointing to that kind of interconnection per se, but it is much stronger than anything that we have here. And so that as we sin, right, we make a moral action, the physical world gets corrupted. Like that means there's some kind of connection between us and our physical bodies and this physical world we're in here. That the text presumes and it undergirds and it drives the story forward, that if we don't connect that in our heads, then we'll just miss out 1/3 of what's going on here. And it's going to carry throughout the rest of the Old Testament, right? The Holy Land is quite fundamental to the story. Would y'all agree, right? People are still fighting over the land of Israel because it matters. The land matters. Now, one of the problems that we have living in North America is we could care less about property. How many of you have moved more than 5 hours in distance in your lifetime?
Like move houses?
Yeah, you picked up, you live somewhere else, and then you live.
Yeah, in a radius, like I go from point A to point B.
Yeah. Okay, right? We are not worried at all about living somewhere else different because we have very little roots to the land we live in. America is a very mobile, right, society. I lived in England for 5 years, and the difference they say between England, and this goes for continental Europe as well. I've spent some time in Budapest over Christmas, and for us, 200 years is a long time, right? In Europe, right? 200 years, that's like, a decade almost as far as history goes, right? People in Budapest taking their history back to first century, definitely 1,000 years ago, easily they trace their history back. So for us, 200 years is a long time, but for them, 200 miles is a long distance. And it's hard to conceive that, but when you go, like in England, if you know much about English accents, Liverpool is only 2 or 3 hours from where I lived in Durham, radically different accents. If you drive 2 hours from here, unless you're driving towards Louisiana, right, you won't hear much of a different English accent. So if you go to Dallas, can you tell the difference between somebody from Dallas and somebody from Houston? Maybe a little bit difference. People in Dallas would say Houston. If you're from this area, you might say Houston, right? You drop that H a little bit.
What?
Yeah, you're not. You listen to people that have lived here their whole life. They will say the H almost like a Y. Houston. What do British people call this city? Houston. Even after you repeat it to them over and over again, it's Houston. No, Houston. So, all right.
That's why we won the war.
Yes. Okay. But so distance, because but they grew up in that land for hundreds, even thousands of years, right? Your family, even if you haven't moved more than 5 hours yourself, almost nobody's family has been in Houston more than 100 years. Because Houston itself almost didn't exist 100 years ago. It took the hurricane to wipe Galveston off the map for everybody to move inland and decide to reestablish a port city, right? And that happened just over 100 years ago.
And so in this sense, like, we have no history here. But you look at like tribal nations, like when you think of, if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, right? The Hutu and the Tutsi, right? Those tribes have lived in that land for as long as any memory is. And so the fight is not just about people, it's about place and identity of whose place is that and where is my identity. And so if you lose that place, then who am I as a people? So in Hungary is where I was staying at. They lost about half to 2/3 of their land after World War I. And so you have this nationalist resurgence in Hungary of like, we need to reclaim our identity, but it's almost impossible for them to take that land back. So what is our identity if we don't have all this land that we've lost 100 years ago? And it's this whole sense of like, so you have this right-wing nationalism that's very anti-immigrant. You think the rhetoric we have here is bad against immigrants and those people of color and things. It's very strong in Hungary. It's one of the widest places I've been in a long time because they don't want anybody to come in and spoil their place, right? But it's partially this idea that we lost the land, so then we had to fight for all these other things so we don't lose that as well. And so as we read the text, we have to understand that all these things come together. So again, cursing here is not specifically said of the people, but it plays in across there, right? And I've used the theological term of exile here. You're kicked out of the place you were supposed to be. And of course, that's going to play out in the rest of the Bible. All right, so we said that Christianity, and particularly Judaism, is a rescue religion. There's a problem here. And the rest of these covenants that we're going to go through are going to show the response to that problem. So we're going to move a few chapters forward. Of course, everything, that chaos just becomes even everywhere, right, for the next several chapters. And in chapter 12, we get to Abram, who is later known as Abraham, and we see a restoration or a step towards a restoration or a turn in the story. So again, chat with your neighbor about what you see at play here in these texts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the curse is still there, the baby.
Okay, this is rocket science here. So somebody on the fourth row. Somebody on the fourth row. Where do we see land at play here? Somebody on the fourth row. Where do we see? This is the back row. If you're having trouble counting, where do we see land at work here? Yeah, so he's going to go to a new land, right? So this is where we get the idea of a promised land. Later in the text or throughout tradition, we call this the Holy Land, right? But that's important here. So he's leaving, right? He moved more than 5 hours. Almost unheard of in the ancient world because there's no like universal police force, right? I went to Budapest. I did not worry at all about not only knowing one other person in that country before I got there. Because the rule of law exists, right? In the ancient world, you pick up and move. What's the rule of law? The person with the biggest stick rules. And so if you don't have a big family, if you're a foreigner, you're at the total mercy of those people to treat you well. So that's a big ask, to go somewhere else where you don't have family to protect you, right? Okay, so thank you. Okay, where do we see community here then? Okay, what happens, how do you become a great nation? Yeah, you have to have lots of kids, right? They have sex, right? It's presumed here, but yes, that's part of it. And then what's the language then about the look up, right? God's interaction with Abram here. What's the language that describes that? Okay, bless you, right? In fact, as a good reader of text, right, I told you, how do you read a book well? You start with its title, right? Another way to read text well is, what are repeated terms and phrases? In fact, how many times is the word bless repeated here? Yeah, 5 or 6 times, right? I think that might be an emphasis of what this text is trying to get across to you. Okay, so when God chooses Abraham and his family, why does he choose them? Does he love them more? When he narrows down to these people, does God love the Jews more than everybody else? We don't like that idea. There is a text in Romans 9 that says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. We feel pretty nervous. You've got your God of the Old Testament or the God of the Bible list, right? You should feel comfortable with him doing some judgment and hating on people, right? That should be in your mental categories. So why do you not want him to hate all these other nations and only love the Jews? Okay, so we'd be kicked out, right? We're good postmodernists. We believe everything goes, right? There's no one right way to do anything anymore. Everything's okay.
It just seems arbitrary. It's just,
Yeah, it does seem arbitrary. Yeah, that's, of course, has anybody ever blamed the Bible about being arbitrary? Again, so it has categories of its own that we don't want to impose on it. But one of the things that marks out those that are participants is circumcision. So the sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision. So if you're not circumcised, then you cannot participate in this covenant. And so, of course, this becomes a huge issue in the New Testament. Can you have Abraham as your father without being circumcised? Can Christians sing the Father Abraham song? There's a Sunday school song, Father Abraham has many sons, right? You do these crazy, okay, so if you don't know, you're not missing out on anything. But all right, so let's go back to why did God, is there something in this text that says why they were chosen? Yeah, so does he love the Jews more than everybody else? Who does he love? Yeah, all nations, right? He chooses them out, singles them out, not to give them all the blessing. It's as a vocation to bless the rest of the world, right? So they have a task, a vocation, a responsibility. And so we'll come... That's easy enough, right? I'm not going to belabor that. You can read the text, right? So here's, God start off with the whole world, and God chooses this one people, but why does he choose them? Right, to bless the whole world again. That's the fundamental tenet here. So it's not that God cares about this one people more. So this is an important point here. What do we see that is interesting about this chart?
it's a restoration of the state of the garden.
It's almost mirror except for the different land.
Yeah, it's the same. So when we talk in terms of a biblical theology of, rather than restoration or covenant, use the term salvation. When we come to salvation, it's exactly the same as what? The Garden of Eden. So this marks out what human flourishing looks like. And when it gets crapped up and God comes and fixes it again, what does it look like? It looks like that over there. In fact, if we're drawing, right, this is where you start to draw the dotted line through the whole narrative of Scripture, because where did we see over here at the very end of the story, what does human flourishing look like? Creation. So when we talk about salvation, it's not something about leaving here and going up there. In fact, Revelation said the up there is going to come down here. And so this is a fundamental deal because the land actually matters. Was it a mistake that God created humans on the earth? Does the Bible present it as a mistake that God created humans on earth and he has to fix by taking us up somewhere else? No, the whole story is like God cares about this place down here. We care about it. And so if he's going to come save it, he's got to save this part of us. This stuff. Right? All of this matters. Because you can't fix us without fixing this stuff because we are this stuff. You get it? And so if you're going to read the Bible rightly, you've got to see that interconnection that pumps through the whole thing, right? It's the flow, it's the vision that holds the whole thing together. And so again, as good postmodernists, right, we want to read the Bible as just about individuals or maybe about power structures between communities. And the whole thing is like you can't have one without the other. And so all of these things work together. And so as we get into the Mosaic covenant then, all we're going to see is an extension of the Abrahamic. Let me point to this real quick and then we'll end and I'll let you read some of these texts for next time. Because once we have the paradigm down, seeing it play out in the other texts is quite clear. So Exodus 19, this is right before the Ten Commandments are given. So God is making a covenant with this people. And he says, hey, I have saved you. Now, go do the things that I've told you to do for the purpose that, what's the purpose of the covenant, the Mosaic covenant? What does a priest do? On behalf of whom? Somebody else, right? People that have problems, right? They mediate between problem people, they mediate between that person and God. Who are the Jews mediating between? Yeah, the nations, right? The whole purpose of the Mosaic covenant is that they would mediate God's presence and reality to the nations. Where have we seen this before? It's in the Abrahamic covenant, right? They chose them out of the whole world in order to bless and mediate that, right? So their holiness then is to be a conduit for everybody else. Okay, one last thing here. We got the Ten Commandments. We're getting into the God that starts killing people left and right. Or at least this is the way we perceive the story. Is God's judgment or God's mercy foregrounded in this text? Yeah. So in this sense, God's judgment, right? You've got this whole idea to the third and fourth generation. This likely has to do with the idea that people live in the same household, right? So grandparents, parents, and kids and grandkids are all living in the same household. So if sin happens, it's going to play out and everybody's going to be burdened by that. And you'll know that we live in much more isolated houses, but if your parents struggle with something, right? Whether you struggle with it internally or externally, you're going to struggle with it as well, right? So there's that problem that goes along with that. But what's the whole idea here is that this is the focus. In fact, this is one of the most repeated passages in the rest of the Old Testament. And so we're back to the question, what is the image of God that the Bible wants you to have? The stereotypical image of God
maybe not that far from what you thought Jesus was about. That the Old Testament is already saying, hey, I'm a saving God. I'm merciful, gracious. In fact, if we're going to put a number on it, if I gave you $1,000 or $4 as two options, door number 1 or door number 2, you're always going to take $1,000, right? That's the ratio of God's grace to his judgment. And in fact, we in our minds conceive it the exact opposite. We tend to think of God as 1,000 times judgmental in the Old Testament, and every once in a while he gives a little candy away to, right? And yet maybe we've not read the text along with the flow of the text. And so what is the text itself trying to drive you and to set your expectations of what love and judgment look like rather than using kind of modern secular categories? And so as you go back, so your task is to go read the rest of these texts related to the Mosaic Covenant, the Davidic Covenant, the New Covenant particularly, and these other texts that I have there, in order to think through where do we see God's grace and mercy playing out to a broken world? Okay, I will be back next week. See y'all then.